Okay, I don't have a lot of time, so the game is Unhappy King Charles. Enjoy my living conditions. Usually I manage to temper it a little bit, but I've got roofers who are causing serious issues. Among them, right outside my window, they're hauling stuff up and down, tiles, etc. So, this game, Unhappy King Charles, at least close. Hey, that's a lot better. Unhappy King Charles. This is almost impossible to think. This is a Charles Vassy game. I've got actually his prequel or predecessor game to this, The King's War, down here, which I really kind of want to give a try too. I've taken a peek at that, but I haven't really, I haven't even clipped it or anything. But a lot of people are interested in looking at this as a CDG that has a lot of respect, and they thought that there may be aspects of it that I'll like maybe more or less or whatever than some others. I'm not sure what motivates people to request things, to tell you the truth. But this had a reasonable number of requests and a number of people specifically asking for it. Rather than just thumbing. Let me get some air again. Yeah, I know it's noisy. Okay. So what's up with this game and what's a little different from most CDGs here? Well, let's take a look. See, I've buried everything under here so that I could give you the box shot. But in there is my sequence of play sheets. But let's take a look first off at the map, which has certainly attracted some attention by putting England kind of in what feels like the wrong direction. And this is not terribly surprising because, well, Vassy, I believe, is a Scotsman, and in a sense he's given Scotland a prominence. Well, I'm not sure it really is prominence, but a position that is not usual for it. To tell you the truth, I generally look at the northern side of the board as the more prominent side, but that's just me being a northerner. Anyway, it is kind of odd though, because you have half the map facing in one direction, and you can tell that by the writing. Well, the entirety of the map, and then all the charts and tracks are facing in the other direction. That's kind of a weird design decision. It works fine. You know, one player sits, the Protestant and parliamentary player sits on this side, the Royalist and Catholic player sits on that side. So it works fine for that. Now, let's take a look at what our components look like and how they kind of, other than the map, how they kind of work here. So here is your common military unit, and it has a strength point, a name, and a location where it's mustered. And you have two types of units, veteran and militia. Militia have one strength point, veterans, and we can find one somewhere. Veterans have two, as you can see. That's the only difference between the two. And that's significant. It's twice as powerful, right? You also have little chits to mark who has sort of political control of an area. The map itself contains a couple of different kind of features. The circles are normal, you know, it's obviously a point-to-point area movement system. The circles are your normal points. I don't want to call them areas because they're not, even if they functionally are the same. These are kind of more minor fortresses. They're limited fortresses. They're able to supply themselves, but they're not able to project their supply out in the countryside the same way as these more full-scale fortresses. You have these little squares sitting on their edge, which serve as reminders of where a local notable is going to be placed. Well, here's a local notable that starts the game on the board, and these are just people who have such an influence in their area that they will be difficult to root out, and they can also provide some kind of capability for controlling the area around them. And let's see what else we might have on here. This kind of pink stuff here, which is those are industrialized areas or something like that. They provide a economic benefit of sorts, and they also have other effects in the game according to the cards. You got a little cup full of naval chits. This is just a randomizer to determine where on this chart things are. You'll draw a chit and apply that number, positive or negative. The numbers tend towards the positive, which is the pro-parliamentarian side. You have an assessment of all the different leaders. Most importantly, any special abilities for them are summarized here right on the map, where it's very easy to find, and I found this very helpful. You have also their level, which is how highly ranked they are. Level 1s outrank level 2s, etc. And you can subordinate lower level generals. You can't subordinate your own rank. You have these player aid cards with boxes on them that you're actually essentially forced to put your troops into. How important is that? I don't know. The number of troops that you have, the number of counters you have in a stack is always known information. So it's not really serving a great hidden counter purpose there, and I don't see any reason why you couldn't just put them on the map if that's more convenient. I actually find it probably more so, and we'll maybe switch to that. You also have a space where you can put leaders that are available for play. Unemployed generals allow certain units that have been dispersed, as well as the commanders who've lost their units, placed to rest for a turn until they can be deployed again. Like in games, trying to remember which one here. Certainly, Washington's War has this, but a number of these CDGs have this concept that you can only play one card for recruitment each turn. This is in play for this, and that's one of the restrictions. Now, there are other ways to get units, but you're only allowed to use one of your operations cards. The cards themselves are a little different from normal operations event cards. So this one is just an operations card. It gives you 3 operations points. Whereas events give you just an event. And they have the faction that is affected by them listed up in the corner. Now you'll notice this says Alt History. We have a number of different decks here. First of all, each player has their core cards, a couple of cards, just operations that they'll always have each turn coming into their hand that they can do stuff with. On top of that, we have mandatory cards, and this will get dealt in with the top 9 cards and split out and dealt out in the first hand of the game. This is necessary for people to attack each other. So whoever holds that card can kind of determine the flow of how quickly the game actually starts, because before that it's just maneuvering and political actions. Okay, so those are the mandatory cards. There's a handful of them, only 3. What you see, what you see over here in this stack is the early war cards, and we've got this situation in other games where you have mid-war, late war, except here you don't reshuffle the deck. Once you go through a deck of cards, it's mostly gone. There's the possibility that the parliamentary player can draw a random card from the discard pile. And finally, when the mid-war and late war come into play, 2 cards from the Alt History deck get thrown into each one and shuffled in at random. Additionally, at the top of those decks, a new mandatory card comes into play to indicate changing major political events. One of them being the Covenanters coming down from Scotland, and the second one being the new model armies, which strongly changes the flavor of play. So you've got this kind of different mechanism for getting the cards out. And what's kind of cool here is events that are in another person's hand if they're in the wrong person's hand, they don't actually get played as events. They probably get discarded. So those alt history cards may not come into play. They may just be in the wrong person's hand. But likewise, the real historical events might not get played. And in fact, many of them might not get played for their historical effect anyway, just because they have preconditions. That's not too big a deal. I didn't feel, I've played this once before, I didn't feel like players were terribly, I didn't feel like major events were being held up and not coming into play. The mandatory events are really the big game shifters here. The others could be important events, especially something like a local notable showing up that, too bad you don't have that, but they're only important in the game sense rather than, you know, something that really, you would say, shaped the war seriously. What about the rulebook? Well, I'm going to have to break down and show you. Under here, there's sort of a playbook and some a compendium of the cards, and then here we have this. Very cool how they did the typeface on the front, etc., to make it look like, you know, one of the old pamphlets, either from that time or a little later. The actual rulebook was, like many CDGs, a pain in the butt. You know, the game itself doesn't play that hard, but there are a lot of little special cases and different ways of handling everything, and this is no exception to that. This, for example, has its own combat system, completely different from every other combat system that I think I've seen in a CDG. How big a deal is it? Well, no, they're very easy, intuitive little combat systems. In this case, it's a very good one, and we can get to it in a moment, but you gotta learn each one and unlearn all the others. And likewise, you gotta unlearn and learn what all the different movement differences are, and all the little rules that, you know, handle the cards, etc. This one has some weirdnesses in many different ways. And again, you have this, although this is a fairly early one, but this feeling that every CDG seems to want to redesign. They take this fundamentally, you know, innovative idea of the CDG, and they want to make their own tweaks to it. But instead of just, you know, making tweaks that are easy, something you look up on a chart that you'd be looking up anyway, it's stuff in the rules itself. It's in the core mechanisms that you have to relearn with every game. And that's one of my big gripes. And then, of course, the rules themselves may not be the easiest to cope with here. Did they have an index? They do have an index. That definitely helps. I found it was kind of difficulty. I found difficulty finding some stuff some of the times. It's always the issue with an index, right? We have the glossary, which is also another standard feature in these CDGs. I didn't feel that it was terribly required in this game. In the sense that I'm glad it's there and everything. It's not like that. But it felt more like more conventional war games to me. Too many of these CDGs have gone to, oh yeah, you had to read the glossary to even understand the rules. You have to understand this specific meaning of the word army here, etc. Although I am getting kind of used to what is in effect here. And army, well, it is pretty obvious because there isn't a lot else. There's nothing else that can really move. But armies are pretty easy to get. Alright, we've got the setup of the game coming next. I don't know if I've even completed that. I certainly haven't finished the card dealing. Let's go to the sequence of play, because this is, of course, the meat and the heart of the game. So the first thing is this housekeeping phase, where the biggest thing that happens, your generals slide up, and any spaces you're sitting on that aren't fortified become yours if they weren't already. And let's see, then the next, oh, no, that's not now. That's down here. I'm sorry. No. So in the housekeeping phase, step 2 actually isn't that. What it is each player is allowed, starting with the Parliament player, is allowed to place one of these PC markers somewhere on the board. And he has to extend his current PC markers, and in this case, he can't kind of put it next to opposing stuff. This is meant to simulate changes in political allegiances, etc., that aren't directly in the area of conflict. So, you know, it's generally expanding your back areas, which is important because you need a certain number of PC markers to stay in the game. In the game I played, I ended up winning by knocking my opponent below that number. Okay. And then the third thing in the housekeeping phase is on the late turns, which is sort of the summer, autumn of each year, you draw a naval status counter, and the first turn of the game is one of these, and determine a change in the naval status number. That can have effects on certain things like besieging in ports, and also eventually troop recruitment. Veteran units can come in more easily because of that. All right, now, political control phase. This is where you get control of the areas you're sitting on that you don't control currently. And then there's a political isolation. As soon as I read that, I said, oh shit, it's going to be like We the People, Washington's War. It's not. It handles isolation well. Isolation is you trace to an army. Cool. I mean, you know, that sounds like the same. Or to a real fortress, or to a local personage. And if you can't do any of those things through controlled or neutral spaces, your unit gets destroyed. Well, now, if my understanding is correct, this unit's out of supply on turn 1, which are this PC marker's out of supply on turn 1. It's isolated. I'm going to have to look that up and make sure it's the case, but that's my understanding of it. It's much, much more intuitive, much, much more believable than some kind of Go game where you have to maintain liberties of empty spaces to make any sense. Definitely have to commend the designer on not slavishly following really, really questionable ideas, which I can't believe made it into Washington's War as well. Okay. You'd just think that that concept would have gotten enough flack to have withdrawn from it, because to me it simply is not believable and not defensible. Alright, but let's see what else we got here. Recruitment phase. Okay, so each player is going to get a certain amount of recruitment, and that's based on this number, number on this chart here. Now you'll notice there's a lot of information on these charts. For example, when you draw the naval chit is handled on there. Not necessarily in the right order exactly, but that's okay. Again, a lot of helpful player aids embedded right on the map charts. And I also find it kind of attractive. My wife made one mention about this as a CDG point-to-point type game. Wow, I can see where things go. Now, me, I find it a little bit too in your face to have all these circles and dots. But yes, it is very, very easy to read this map in terms of seeing what's connected to what. You can get rid of the map and the bubbles and the lines really stand out to you. I would prefer, although she totally does not, the more subdued ones, although it is harder to tell what's adjacent, and I make big mistakes with such maps like, with Clash of Monarchs or Halls of Montezuma. This one I'm more likely to be able to play the game, but I'm less likely to enjoy what I see on the board, and that kind of disturbs me. But, okay. Let's step to the recruitment. So this has 2 numbers on it. The first number is the one you care about here. That's how many free recruits each guy gets each turn. Both sides get it. Just shows kind of the up and down of the war. What's the second one? Well, the second one's always 2. And that's how many recruitments you get from playing a recruitment card with full effect. Okay? Alright. What does recruitment mean? Well, for each recruitment point, you can pick from one of these stacks. Now, those stacks are set up so that the militia's always on top, and you always draw from the top. So unless you have your militia on the board already, or dead, which is quite possible as well, you're not going to get a veteran unit. Now, there are exceptions to that. In particular, the naval status chart, I believe, allows them. But also, on the first 2 turns of the game, there's this Powis Bridge rule in effect, which allows the Royalists to pick one of their recruits each turn, however they get it, and they'll probably take one of these, and put it as a veteran unit. Where can you put your units? Well, not just anywhere. Strangely enough, you can put them on one of these little recruiting symbols of the right color. So this matches the south, so you'd need a southern troop to go with that. And these are kind of hard to see with the camera, but the color distinctions are fairly visible to my eye. You also have the letter distinction in case you have difficulty with the colors. But I find it fairly easy to capture there. Here, if you're really actually colorblind, you might have some serious difficulty distinguishing some of the color choices. One particularly bad choice in this case is to put green and red next to each other because so many people have the green-red color blindness. That's, those are going to look exactly the same to them. It's going to be hard to distinguish which one is which, at a quick glance especially. Okay, so you can build it in one of these little soldier markers if the flag's the right color and it's not controlled by your opponent. You could also build it in these local notables, and there may be additional rules as to where else you can build it. I'll look them up. It's been a couple days since I played, and already the rules are fading from my head. Okay. Then you draw the strategy cards. Now on the first turn of the game they're already dealt out, but normally you're going to get your 2 core cards back, and you're going to get 4 new cards. That gives you 6 cards. On each turn you must play 6 cards. But on the first turn of the game you have 7 cards. You may play a 7th card, but you can also bury a card at the end of the strategy card phase. This is your ace in the hole card. Well, most of these games allow you to hold maybe 1 card. This one allows you to keep accumulating cards indefinitely, but it's very hard to get additional cards. So you may want to save that card on that first turn. You may not want to kick that in as quickly as possible. Having an extra card on some other turn may be more important than having it on that first turn. Might be the other way around though. We'll see. So anyway, if the deck runs out, things happen. In particular, let's see. It is possible for the early deck to run out and nobody to have a draw, I believe. It's a little unlikely, but if there's a lot of major victories, there could be cards taken from it. With the second deck, if that runs out, that automatically triggers the population of the third deck. Okay, now you get to campaign, and that is going to be largely like most CDGs, and based on the new model army, whether or not that's occurred, one player or the other gets to decide who goes first. At the beginning of the game, the Royalists get to decide who goes first. At the end of the game, after the new model army, the parliamentary player gets to decide. Then we go to the Blockade Phase. Now what this is it's possible, if you're at the beginning of the game besieging something, to flip it over to the blockade and siege side if you've got a port hex, or a space that you're sieging. That means that your navy is going to try to help bombard it, and you get, at this stage, the blockade stage, a free bombardment on the space. And then we go to desertion. And we see here there's a desertion number. Well, that's the number of troops each side just loses. Doesn't matter what your stacking situation is or whatever. Now, which units you lose is based on situational stuff. And then at the end of losing those units due to desertion, If you still got some big stacks, you start losing due to supply attrition as well. And then, let's see, where do we go? Finally, we go to the power base phase. You've got a number here, and that's a constantly increasing number to show the will to fight is decreasing. If you don't have enough PC markers on the map at this point to match that number, or exceed it, you lose. It's not the only way to lose. Good old Chucky can lose by losing a battle. If he loses a battle, if he surrenders, if he loses a siege and surrenders, basically if all his troops are wiped out, well, he loses his head too, and that's no good. It makes him very unhappy. On the other hand, Chucky can win by having London and 2 complete areas. Now, London's hard to get for at least 2 turns in a row. Well, for exactly 2 turns in a row, because you're not going to keep playing after he wins. Okay, I'm going to take a little pause, load up another, grab another video, and go into some more details on the rolls. Okay, so let's try to look at a few of the special cases here. Taking a look actually already at the strategy cards, but not so much what you can do with your points in them. As with most of these games, actual operations points, one of the things they can do is you can command a unit, and I didn't explain this. You got 2 numbers on your units. These are pretty standard for CDGs. You got a strategy rating and a battle rating. The strategy rating is what is the strength of the card that you have to play to get that guy moving. Pretty standard factor. You also have, though, some of these guys have a colored band. Those are their home areas. So, for example, Waller is effective in the South and the Midlands, but once he gets out of there, his people start deserting him at a faster rate in the desertion phase, for example. He's simply considered less effective there. He's a regional noble. You may also play a card, instead of just moving a unit, to bombard a fortress. Let's see what else you can do. You're allowed to play your card in the recruitment box, which will give you additional recruits. Now, in the best of cases, for the parliamentary player at least, I haven't looked too carefully at the royalist player. I wasn't playing him. But you get your brigades, up to 2 brigades, and they get placed kind of the way your starting brigades were placed. You can't put them both in the same space on the board, but they can be in the same region. For the royalist player, however, their card are grandee cards, and they can only place them in a regional general or a local notable who's not subordinated, and they just have a little bit more restriction. They can't put them in sort of their general armies. They have to give them to people, well, with the local generals, to people who are going to be a pain in the butt in shifting those armies anywhere else. For the regional, for the local notables, as opposed to the regional generals, for the local notables, you can go and pick up their troops. So that's probably the better solution if you're trying to move troops somewhere else. Of course, they can't move, which is kind of their negative. Okay. Like I said, you can activate the general for movement. You can also spend a card on a local notable. And what's cool about a local notable is he can reach anywhere within 2 of him for each operations point and flip a flag. For the most part, you can't flip PC markers without moving an army into there, or having a battle, I suppose, requires an army. Okay, and a major or minor campaign can do multiple versions of that. So a major campaign or a minor campaign gives you 3 or 2 activations, but you don't have to do them all with generals. You could use one of those campaigns to say, let's say raid with a local notable, and you could use another one to activate a general for movement or for siege. So final option, you can play a card for PC markers, which you simply extend your current line of PC markers. This one, unlike the earlier one, doesn't have a restriction. You can place, say, next to the opponent with this one, as long as you're extending your own line as it existed before that play. So you can't chain things. You couldn't go running out like this, because this space would not have been adjacent at the beginning of the play. Okay. Most of the commanders cannot command more than 4 units. But some of the commanders in here will say they may command up to 9 brigades. If you're commanding a larger force than 4 units, you have to put a major army marker on top of yourself. And that has some restrictions and effects. Let's see. For one thing, it requires a 3-point activation card to move the units. For another, and I am totally going to need this, so I'm not going to show you poor Charles's face anymore in this game, because I need to pull this out at some point or another. We have a little chart that indicates how big your army is versus how many movement areas it gets. Likewise, this also gives it how many spaces that it can evade if it's running away. Small armies can actually run 2 spaces away, which is kind of potent. All right. Let's take a look at the core cards. Obviously can't be discarded as normal. You put them aside because you're going to get them back. The others go in the discard pile, though, unless they say once only, in which case they're removed from the game. But remember, most of these cards really are once only. Once they go to the discard pile, they're not coming back again except through winning a battle. Okay, what about event cards? So a couple of the event cards are response cards, which can be played during the other person's action. There aren't a lot of these in here. Like I said, I think there's 2. And event cards have special rules as usual, where they may affect the PC markers, the building, removal of units, whatever. That all works fine. Some things, however, if you don't like an event card, or if it's not yours, you can throw it, as long as it's not a mandatory, you can discard it, and it becomes a limited 1 operations card. You can't use it to activate a field general or regional general for movement or bombardment, but you can place a PC marker, or activate a raiding noble, or use it in recruitment. Of course, it's only a 1-point recruitment here, as you can see here. Only gives you 1 unit, but essentially, if you get a handful of the other players' events especially, these are things that are totally useless to you, but at least you're depriving them of these cards at some point or another, right? It's hard to tell which way you want your hand to fall, but it feels like whatever you get is going to be of some value to you. It's either an event that you could try to activate and use to your own advantage, or it's operations points you can use, or it's something that deprives the other player and gives you a limited amount of operation points, sort of. Lots and lots of rules on the mandatory cards. These are all very special rules that come into play once for each of them. I'm not going to go into too much detail with them, except for one biggie. The raising of the standard card, you can't fight. You can't move in. You can't attack other people while that's not been played yet. That's the first big effect. Some individual special event cards that have their own rules in the rule book because they couldn't fit on the card as well. Another issue with CDGs in general, there's just so much room so much real estate on a card for the text. There aren't a lot here. You can look them up, but it's still kind of an annoyance to have this design that has the card on it and not a lot of information. And there aren't all that many events. There are a lot of operations cards that don't have an event on them. Rules for adding to the deck. Winter of 1643 is when the second deck comes into play. And it just gets shoved under the first deck at that point. Which is to say, if you run out of cards before that, people don't get draws. If you don't run out of cards before that, it just gets stuck under there and is then available. So it's kind of a weird situation with that. Specifics on recruitment. Alright. At some point, troops can become dispersed, basically by the player's option if they don't want to fight a battle, in which case they go into the unemployed generals box and they become available at a replacement rate in later terms. You get to recruit them additionally. I think you get half of them. And then the other half you put back in your stacks. When units are lost due to attrition or desertion, they go back to your stacks. When they're lost in combat, they're lost for good, pretty much. There might be cards that recover them. In fact, the game says that there are. I didn't see any. But the units themselves will normally not be recruitable again. This is important because if you fight a close-fought battle, you're likely to lose your veteran units. Whereas if you win a battle, the opponent, the weaker side, can lose its militia units. Kind of an interesting little device in there as well. Oh, placing recruited brigades. Yeah, we've got all that. We've got all that. Recruitment cards. Generals. Okay, one kind of neat thing, you can bring your commanders into play kind of when you want. If you want them in the recruitment phase, when you slap new troops down, yeah, you can put them down then. If you've got a stack of troops that don't have a leader, hey, play a card that activates a leader you've got in your reinforcement box, slap them down on the board, and get them moving right away. Again, why not? It's kind of a neat mechanism again. There's certainly room and time in this period for people to move around and take command of a new army in this point. But troops, once they're kind of assigned to someone, stick to them. You can't get rid of your troops. And here's the thing. If you want to stack together to, say, operate a larger force with multiple leaders together, the only way to coordinate them is to subordinate one leader to another, in which case one leader, the top leader in the stack, has to have a rank that's lower than every other leader there, and the others are subordinated to them. There might also be restrictions to how you subordinate, to who can subordinate to who. So, for example, Essex and Waller will not work together normally. There's also, on top of that, still this 9 brigade limit. That's a hard limit. Nobody can command more than 9 brigades, and that includes your subordinates. So you don't get more command ability by having subordinates. It's the only way you get troops into your army, because they've attached to some other general. Again, nice feel there. If your general ends up without troops, hey, he wanders off the unemployment box and tries to collect a pension. He'll come back next turn. Movement interception. Hey, movement and interception is very, very... the interception side of things is very simple. It's if you want to intercept into an adjacent space, and this is very much like almost all the CDGs, you roll a die. In this case, you have a 50% chance of intercepting, modified by the difference in the strategy values. So if I have a strategy value of 1 and you have a 2, I intercept on a 3 or better. The precise numbers, etc., are sometimes different, but it's pretty easy to catch that. Again, withdrawal works very much the same way. If somebody moves into me, I can withdraw on a die roll in the same sort of fashion, and there's a possibility of withdrawing multiple spaces. Also, interception, doesn't change who the attacker is. Just because I intercept you, it's still the person who's moving, who's moving into that space that I'm intercepting into, who is the attacker, and they can't withdraw from it. They get stuck in a battle as the attacker. Now, being the attacker isn't terrible in this game. In a lot of games, it's got more of a penalty. Here, it really isn't. You have different kind of movement lines, regular roads, you have these mountains, and then you have one little maritime line. And roads are 1 movement point, mountains and maritime are 2. There's also some retreat restrictions, so the maritime one you can't evade. Oh no, I'm sorry. Only 2 units can evade or retreat across it, and you can't use it for political isolation to give you your supply line for that and stuff like that. Once you get into battle itself, this is very simple. You count up the strength points that each side has. Each leader has this battle rating. Whoever's in command applies their battle rating. If one side has higher than the other, he gets that many more pluses, essentially. Basically, both sides add their command rating to the number of strength points they have. They roll a die. They add it all together. They compare. Who got more? Well, to the large extent, whoever got more wins the battle. But if the difference is only 1 point, or if they're tied, it's a drawn battle. And both sides lose a veteran brigade. And it's possible to sort of win a drawn battle in terms of holding the space. So if the attacker scored more, he holds the space, otherwise the defender holds the space. But there's no other effect other than who retreats there. On a 2 through 4 point swing, it's an indecisive victory. The person who has the higher score won the battle. The loser loses a brigade, and they can lose a militia if they like. Remember, these losses are permanent. Finally, if the score is 5 or more, it's a major victory. Now, this is kind of weird, because to me, if 3 or 4 brigades defeat 1 brigade, it doesn't feel like what I'd call a major victory. But okay, let's see what the effect is of it before we start criticizing it, because name-wise, it's disturbing me. To me, a major victory should be a fairly decisive, but it doesn't have to be all that huge, battle where the battle is significant. So in this case, if there's a major victory, the higher score wins, and the loser loses 2 brigades, which can be militia. Okay, so far that's not too big a deal. And it can become a decisive battle if certain conditions are met. Okay, well, what are those conditions? Let's take a look here. So in a major battle, you get a bonus strategy card. How do I feel about that? Overwhelming force breaking a small force? Alright. Maybe it's important enough. Maybe the morale effect of that attack is enough that a strategy card makes sense. Now that strategy card goes into my hand, and I have to play it immediately after the activation, or discard it. I don't know if I don't believe that those cards count towards your 6 played, which means they're not going to help me bury more cards for later turns. Remember, that's a rare occurrence. Okay. Now, in the event... and where you get the cards from is different for the different players. The Royalists take the top card from the unused deck. The Parliamentarians shuffle the used deck, the discards, and get a card from there. Alright, but how do you go to the decisive victory? Ah, yes. Okay, so some of the cards that you can play in combat, which aren't exactly reaction cards, they're combat cards, and they count towards your 6 cards you got to play in each turn. Say decisive victory on them. If you play one of those cards and get a decisive victory, or get a major victory, it becomes a decisive victory, which means the opponent doesn't get to lose militia. They have to take their 2 losses as veteran units, and instead of 1 card from the draw, you get 2. Okay, so here I'm beginning to feel like, okay, so all that it really matters is how good my bonus is. It doesn't matter how big the battle was, how important the battle was. That bothers me a little bit. Terrible? No, not really, because the effects aren't that great. It's not like there's victory points changing hands based on this. But there are new cards coming into play which does essentially affect that. So, I don't know, that momentum feel, what really is a minor victory of maybe, 1 unit being swamped by 7 units or something, I can't be convinced that there's that huge a modifier to it. But anyway, if you win the battle, your PC marker turns to your side. In 1644 and 1645, you have a turncoats rule. If you defeat your enemy, you may recruit a bonus brigade from amongst the defeated, essentially. The defeated unit's still destroyed, it still goes in the box, but you get a free recruit there. And that gives you, a significant bonus in terms of swinging. It's possible that the battles could be nested within one another in the sense that one person draws cards, and then they play those cards. That causes another battle, that causes another victory for one side or the other, which causes more draws. And there are rules for handling that. Basically, you play them out in the order that they're earned, and you finish them off before you go on to the next set. Okay. Political control can be changed. You can change that by walking around. You spend a movement point, you switch political control of the space you're in. It can also be changed by playing operations cards, local notable raids, essentially operations cards, but they can flip it rather than just adding one. And through events, dispersal, which I didn't really explain. So if you can't evade a battle, you can declare you're just dispersing and your army just disappears. And it goes into the unemployed box to come back next turn as new recruits. And when you take a fortress. The desertion rules, there's basically an order to which units will, by which units will choose their desertion, or the player must pick their units for desertion. Basically, though, they just have this number that they have to face for desertion, 1, 2, or 3. They have to lose that many units to desertion. Now the question is which units, and unfortunately, what my wife found out was if you're sieging London as the royalist in the middle of enemy territory, there's a good chance that that stack is going to take lots of desertion, and all your others will be okay. That's really annoying. Basically, the guys you have that are doing the most are going to be perhaps the ones who disappear the quickest. Okay. We've kind of gone into local notables, but there's one little weird factor about these guys. They can have troops, but they don't fight like normal guys. They act more like a weird kind of little fortress, which means you have to besiege them. And the way sieging is handled is each fortress has 2 numbers. For example, this has 1, 4. It takes at least 1 troop to siege the fortress, and you have to get 4 hits on the fortress. Others are a little harder, like you have to have at least 3 units to siege it, plus 11 hits. London should be about the same. The number of units you have to besiege a fortress is increased by any garrison in the fortress, and that, I believe, can be up to 2 units. So that's what I had. I had 2 units in London. She needed to have 5 units there to siege it at all. 5 units is a tough size army to hold together, because that starts suffering not just the depletion results, the desertion results, and if you have armies next to it and everything, those results go higher. But it's also the number upon which you start suffering attrition results, i.e. any army over 5 after the desertions takes an additional unit as an attrition loss. So, if there were 9 units there, and it's a 2 or 3 desertion turn, well, a 3 desertion turn gets rid of 3, that drops you to 6. 1 for attrition, you're down to 5 units. That's the perfect situation. You can't stumble into a battle, you can't do anything. Nothing can go wrong. And if you happen to bring less than 9, you're not going to maintain the siege for that turn. So it's just kind of a painful situation, because as soon as the siege drops below number, it fails. And you just are masking the fortress at that point. So now for the siege, what happens is you're going to roll a die and basically add up the numbers on the die rolls over the turn and mark them down here. And what you've got to do is you've got to reach this other number, the surrender number, which, 11 is a big number to get to. How many rolls do you have to make for that? Well, you do have some possible bonuses, but for the most part, you've got penalties here. Especially as the Royalists trying to bombard, where that can be reduced as well. So, you can get a point for a siege train, or if you have the new model army present. But the port can give a -2. Local notables themselves have this sort of, because they're dispersed, they're harder to siege and harder to take out, so they have a bonus -2 no matter what. Okay. You do have the opportunity, though, to make an immediate assault or an assault. Normal assault is when you get the bombardment factor up to at least 5. Once you get it there, you can attack, but there's certain leaders, Fairfax, Cromwell, Rupert, and Maurice, who can assault no matter what. However, that's dangerous, because you roll 2 dice, and you add a number of modifiers here. Weaker fortresses are easier, etc. If you don't have that 5 bombardment, you subtract 2 from the number, and you need to get a 10 or more. If you don't get that, you may never assault again with that leader. You get a marker that says, I didn't like it. And no matter what, you lose a brigade with the highest combat value. Permanent casualty, probably from a veteran unit. It cannot even be returned by a special card. Rules for handling battles in the siege. Fog of war, you can't look at the other guy's stuff. I'm going to have to come back with just what the victory conditions are, but because I unfortunately ran out of time here. Alright, and the very final thing, how do you win the game? Alright, well, like I've already alluded to, the power base number, at the end of the turn, if you haven't met that, and that number keeps going up and up, you lose the game. Now, the parliamentarian player is actually kicking pretty close to that number from the very beginning. He's got to gain territory to have a chance. Let's take a quick count here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, and this one that I don't think really counts at all, but 20. So I've got a 6-point buffer, which isn't too terrible, but it's fairly easy, I found, to lose a big chunk of that. I was often 2-3 points ahead of my number, and just kind of grasping to grab a little bit of extra territory each turn, so that I had, so that there was no chance that I would fall over there. And then, when it came to time to attack the Royalists, as far as I was concerned, that's exactly how I attacked them. I managed a massive cutting off of their supply, and so if we look down here, everybody down here, if I took this place with the parliamentarians, this area is all reliant on this piece, right? you've got to trace your line out. Right now, the Royalists are fine. There's a lot of empty space, but as the game progresses, empty space goes away, and getting control of certain key locations, for example, this space here, can cut the enemy into multiple pieces, each of which has to have its own supply location. Right now, that's not going to be too tough. But I went about, sieging these central locations and taking them, and then cutting off that southern army. And I just took the entire south in basically one sweeping blow, where the enemy had played a significant amount of effort to get PC markers down there. They all fell just because of some cleverness. And that's kind of what you want to do. You want to force the enemy, you want to take away the enemy's plays with less of your own. You want to make yours count more. No big shock there, but it very much comes to the fore in this game in a way that maybe it doesn't in a lot of war games. And even in some of these point-to-point PC-based games, sometimes it's not so clear that you can do it the way you can in this. This one, it really, really shines out there. For example, in Washington's War, I don't see it as clear that you can manage these kind of sweeping victories. Which one makes more sense, I don't know in this case. But I like the flavor of this a little better. Okay, and then it's also possible for an automatic victory. King Charles surrenders, or if the Royalists are able to have 2 consecutive turns holding London, and controlling 3 separate regions. Now, that's not really that hard. Controlling a region just means having more PC markers than your enemy. And then finally, at the end of the game, you double the number of controlled regions and add the number of economic infrastructure points that you control. Actually, no, complete infrastructures you control, I believe. Yeah, you have to have it in each area of the infrastructure, and no area of the infrastructure can have an enemy brigade. So you actually do have to have PC markers everywhere, and you have to have the enemy knocked out of it to get the economic infrastructure. So you're going to get controlled regions. Now, how do you control a region specifically here? Region control is having PC markers in the majority of areas in a region. So you actually have to have the majority of the total areas. Blank areas don't help. It's not just more than your opponent. Okay. And let's see, what else do we have here? So, yeah, this is painful to read these kind of things. I didn't need to know this. So yeah, the parliamentary player adds the number of economic infrastructures he controls and double the number of controlled regions, and he needs to have 12 or more points, otherwise the king wins. Now, economic infrastructure can also affect other things. It can affect your recruitment if you have none. And I don't know what else here. Actually reading these rules is just always a pain. They're not terribly well written. The actual writing somehow grates on me and catches me. It makes it hard for me to understand. It's not like I don't enjoy it, but it's that it doesn't sink into me in a way that maybe some do. There's a number of optional rules that I'd like to play with, but I haven't played with before, which I'll look over. Stout Cornish men. These are the only things that can be recruited in Truro. Other than that, anything else is going to have to be recruited here in Bath, I guess, from the south. And random desertion order. Roll randomly for your category of desertion that falls first. That takes a little bit of control out of the game. I was able to sit there knowing London would not fall, even though my wife didn't understand completely that she wasn't gonna maintain the siege. I could calculate out and say she's not going to keep it. And I tell her that, and it just didn't sink into her how to count that. Well, if you're rolling the die and not necessarily just taking the same effect each, that can kind of add a little bit of randomness to that, and I think that's cool. Manchester. Parliamentary Eastern Brigades named Eastern Association or Ironsides may only be recruited in the Cambridge recruitment area. Well, Manchester's up here, isn't it? And Cambridge is down here, I thought. Oh, maybe I'm thinking something else. Yeah, Oxford, okay. Well, I don't see a Cambridge recruitment area yet. Wakefield, I don't know. There's Cambridge. That seems a little weird. What do we got here? Eastern Association or Ironsides can only be recruited in Cambridge with Lord Willoughby or with the Earl of Manchester if he's in the Eastern region. Gotcha. And they can be played directly to his command display. If more than one is brigaded, they can go here. Earl of Manchester commanded the army for one of the most important parliamentary organizations, the Eastern Association. Laughter of the courts. If Newcastle's in a stack that lost a decisive defeat, or if there are no royalist PCs in the North region, immediately suspend play, remove him from the game, and replace him with Langdale. 2 royalist northern brigades are also permanently removed from those available to the recruitment and or from those in play. Royalist choice. Newcastle was so embarrassed at Marston Moor that he left England. Lost Withiel. If the Earl of Essex suffers a decisive defeat while 4 or more areas from London, his entire army disperses. By allowing himself to be trapped by the king on the Fowey Peninsula, Essex could have undone the effect of Marston Moor. Anyway, I'll be enjoying playing this solo. I enjoyed playing it 2-player. I did not enjoy learning the rules with my wife. Usually I know a game before I teach the rules. In this case, I had read the rules before, but I had forgotten them. I'm a little bit more up on it now. You can imagine how much worse it was. I mean, we essentially had to read through the rules and try to have them sink in. And of course, we made mistakes doing it that way. I'll probably make mistakes here too, but it should be fun getting this played.